When everything falls apart. Alice never imagined loneliness could weigh so heavily. It was something physical, almost palpable, pressing down on her chest every time she woke up in that empty house by the sea. By the age of 25, she had already experienced more disappointments than many people face in a lifetime. The marriage that promised to last forever had shattered at the hands of infidelity, repeated lies, and empty apologies that echoed ever fainter. When she finally signed the divorce papers, Alice felt a strange mix of relief and abandonment. The beach house she'd received in the division of assets was all that remained of that shattered dream. It was ironic, she thought, how the place that had once represented vacation and joy would now be her refuge from pain. The change happened silently. Few friends offered help. Most sided with him, with the unfaithful husband, with the man who knew how to smile and convince. Alice no longer had the energy to explain, to defend herself, to prove her side of the story. So she just left. The small coastal town was unlike anything she'd ever known. While she'd lived in the hustle and bustle of the city, accustomed to the constant noise and anonymity of crowds, she now found herself surrounded by the sound of the waves and a silence that both frightened and comforted her. For the first few months, Alice built invisible walls around herself. She went to the grocery store only when necessary, responded to curious neighbors with monosyllables, and avoided the empathetic glances that seemed to say, "I know what you're going through," without actually knowing anything. She wanted to rebuild her life, yes, but alone, away from the people who judged, who gossiped, who chose sides as if life were a cheerleading squad. Her only true companion was Biscuit, her cream-coated French bulldog with a black nose. The little dog had been a birthday gift from her husband, back when he still pretended to care. It was funny how Biscuit had become the only good thing left of their failed marriage. When they were married, she and her ex-husband visited that same beach house a few times a year. But they never mingled with the locals. They kept to themselves, interacting only with other tourists passing through, people who weren't truly part of that community. Now, everything was different. Alice was no longer a temporary visitor. She lived there. And even though she wanted to keep her distance, small-town life had its own way of unfolding, of engaging people, of creating connections that didn't ask for permission. But Alice still resisted. Every time someone tried to strike up a conversation, she smiled politely and walked away. Every invitation for coffee was declined with a ready-made excuse. Every gesture of kindness was met with suspicion. After all, she had trusted before, and look what happened. The beach house was in need of repair, peeling paint, rotted deckwood, and leaking gutters that dripped when it rained heavily. Alice spent her days trying to fix what was broken around her, as if by fixing the house she could also fix herself. Biscuit accompanied her everywhere. He slept at her feet when she painted the walls, ran beside her when she walked along the deserted beach at dawn, sat patiently while she cried without warning, letting the tears fall freely because there was no one else to see. The French bulldog had that funny way of tilting his head when he looked at her, as if he truly understood her pain. And perhaps he did, in his own way. Animals have this quiet wisdom that humans lost somewhere along the way. Alice thought she was fine this way, alone but safe, hurt but protected, building a tiny life, but one that couldn't be destroyed again, because there was simply nothing left to lose. She didn't know that everything was about to change. I didn't know that sometimes life takes something precious from us, just to teach us the true value of the things that really matter. She didn't know that the solitude she so embraced was about to be shattered by an event that would force her to do the one thing she swore she would never do again: trust anyone. And it all began on a stormy afternoon, when the sky darkened in a way that foretold something more than just rain. subscribe to the channel, and share this video with your friends. The routine of chosen solitude. Alice's days followed a predictable, almost mechanical rhythm. She woke early, always before full sunrise, as if her body still held the memory of urban commitments that no longer existed. She made coffee in silence. The aroma filled the small kitchen as she looked out the window at the still empty beach, painted with the orange and pink hues that dawn generously brought each day. Biscuit waited patiently for his breakfast, sitting in the same corner of the kitchen, his round, expressive eyes fixed on her. He was the only routine Alice enjoyed, the only presence who asked for nothing more than affection and food. After breakfast came the walks, always along the sand, always when the beach was deserted. Alice had mentally mapped out the times when she could walk without running into anyone, without having to answer polite questions about how she was adjusting. Biscuit loved these walks. His short legs worked hard to keep up with her, and every now and then he stopped to sniff something interesting in the sand or bark at the seagulls that circled defiantly overhead. Alice smiled in those moments. They were small, almost imperceptible smiles, but they were real. With Biscuit, she didn't need to pretend to be okay. She didn't need to hide her sadness or force conversations about a future that still seemed too nebulous to imagine. Back home, she devoted herself to endless repairs. The beach house had been neglected for years, used only for vacations, never truly cared for as a real home. Now each room told a story of abandonment that Alice understood intimately. The peeling walls were like her own emotional defenses crumbling. The creaking floorboards were like the warning signs she'd ignored throughout her marriage. She sanded, painted, hammered. Her hands were covered in paint, her fingers ached, but there was something therapeutic about the manual labor. It was as if each repair in the house was a small step toward fixing what was broken inside her. The local grocery store was her only mandatory interaction with the outside world. She always went on Tuesday afternoons when she knew it would be less busy. She picked up the same items, followed the same path between the shelves, and paid with a polite but distant smile. The market owner, a grey-haired woman with a warm smile named Margaret, always tried to make conversation. Alice would answer the minimum necessary, thank her, and quickly leave, ignoring the knowing look Margaret gave her each time. The afternoons were the hardest. That's when the loneliness weighed most heavily, when memories of the broken marriage returned uninvited. Alice found herself reminiscing about moments that at the time seemed happy, questioning which were real and which were merely well-constructed illusions. She would sit on the wooden deck of the porch, Biscuit lying beside her, and gaze out at the ocean for hours. The waves ebbed and flowed with a comforting constancy, as if to say that life continued regardless of human suffering. Some neighbors tried to reach out in the first few weeks. A woman brought a welcome cake. An elderly couple invited people to a weekend barbecue. A man offered to help with home repairs. Alice thanked everyone politely, but made it clear she preferred to be alone. She wasn't rude, but she was firm enough for them to get the message. Gradually, they stopped trying, and that was exactly what she wanted, or at least that's what she told herself. Nights were for reading. Alice had brought some books from her old house and bought others at a second-hand bookstore she stumbled upon. I read late into the night, until my eyes burned, until sleep came thick enough to leave no room for intrusive thoughts. Biscuit slept at the foot of the bed, snoring softly, and Alice found it funny how that little sound made her feel less alone. It was strange how the presence of a 12-pound animal could fill a void no human could. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Alice created a bubble around herself, a safe, controlled little world where nothing bad could happen because there was simply no room for anything else but her and Biscuit. She convinced herself that she was cured, that this solitary life was all she needed, that she would never again depend on anyone for happiness. But life has a peculiar way of testing our convictions, of putting in our path exactly what we fear most. And for Alice, this test would come disguised as a storm. When fear takes shape, the day began differently. Alice felt it in the air, that inexplicable way only those who live near the sea can perceive. There was an electricity in the air, a silent tension that made the birds fly lower and the wind blow with a strange restlessness. The sky had been grey since early morning, but it wasn't the soft, melancholy grey of ordinary cloudy days. It was a dense, heavy grey that seemed to press everything down, as if carrying the weight of something inevitable. Alice decided to go to the market earlier than usual. Margaret greeted her with her usual kind smile, but this time there was concern in the lady's eyes. "There's going to be a nasty storm today," Margaret said as she packed her groceries. "You better stay inside with the windows tightly closed." Alice nodded her thanks and hurried off. Biscuit was waiting for her in the car, with that anxious expression dogs get when they sense something isn't right in the world around them. On the way back, the first drops began to fall. They were thick, heavy drops, hitting the windshield with increasing force. The wind grew stronger by the minute, forcing the trees to bend in forced reverence. Alice barely managed to park the car in the garage before the rain turned into a deluge. She scooped up Biscuit and ran into the house, feeling the cold water splash onto her back in seconds. Inside the garage, she set Biscuit down and began closing the windows that led into the garage. The sound of the rain was deafening, pounding on the metal roof with a trembling intensity. That's when the first thunder boomed. It wasn't an ordinary thunderclap, the kind that rolls in the distance and then disappears. It was a violent rumble, so close that Alice felt the vibration ripple through her body. The lights flickered, the entire house shook, and for a second she was paralyzed by the primal fear that thunder evokes in even the most rational adults. Biscuit panicked. The puppy began to tremble uncontrollably, his eyes wide with pure terror. He ran back and forth across the garage, trying to find a safe place, but there was no safe place from the infernal noise coming from the sky. Alice tried to pick him up, tried to calm him with soothing words and caresses, but Biscuit was beyond reason. When the second thunderclap came, even louder than the first, the French bulldog simply went crazy. "No, Biscuit, stay here," Alice cried, but her voice was drowned out by the noise of the storm. The puppy found an opening, a crack in the side garage door that Alice had left ajar to air out. It was a tiny space, but Biscuit was small, and fear gave him desperate agility. In a second he disappeared through the crack. Alice ran after him, throwing the door wide open, and was met by a wall of rain so heavy she could barely see a meter ahead. The water was falling so hard it stung her skin, and the cold wind was razor-sharp. "Biscuit," she shouted, her voice lost in the roar of the storm. "Biscuit, come back here!" But there was no answer. Only rain, wind, and thunder that kept booming, as if the sky were at war with itself. Alice ran out into the storm, soaked in seconds, her hair plastered to her face, her eyes stinging from the pouring rain. She called for the dog repeatedly, her voice growing hoarse, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it was about to burst from her chest. He looked around the house, the back garden, the front yard, the path that led to the beach. Nothing. Biscuit had simply disappeared, swallowed by the storm as if he had never existed. The rain continued for hours. Alice only went back inside when she realized she couldn't get any further in the pouring rain, that she was putting her own life at risk by staying outside. She sat on the living room floor, completely soaked, shivering from the cold, and a fear she hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just fear for Biscuit's safety, though that was the more immediate and pressing concern. It was fear of losing the only thing that still made her feel anything other than emptiness. It was fear that life was once again taking away what she loved, as if it were a cruel lesson she was doomed to repeat forever. Alice cried there, alone, with the sound of the storm echoing through the empty house. She cried for her lost puppy, for her broken marriage, for the life that seemed to insist on falling apart every time she tried to rebuild it. When the rain finally began to ease, it was already dusk. Alice changed into dry clothes, but couldn't eat anything. Her stomach was knotted with anxiety. She grabbed a flashlight and went outside again, this time in a light, persistent drizzle. She called to Biscuit until her voice broke completely, until her tears mixed with the rain, until she realized it was too dark and too dangerous to continue. Back home, Alice couldn't sleep. She sat in the living room, staring at the door, as if at any moment Biscuit would appear, wet and regretful, wanting to be held. But he didn't come. The night passed with excruciating slowness. Every noise made her jump, hopeful, only to realize it was just the wind or the rain dripping from the roof. When the sun finally began to rise, Alice was exhausted but determined. She would go out again. She would search the entire town if she had to. She wouldn't rest until she found Biscuit. Because she had already lost a lot in that life, and she wasn't willing to lose anything else without a fight. Days of despair and fragile hope. Alice left the house as soon as daylight allowed her to see clearly. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her throat hoarse from screaming the night before, but none of that mattered. Only Biscuit mattered. She started in the immediate vicinity of the house, calling his name repeatedly, stopping every few steps to listen carefully for any barking, any movement in the bushes, any sign that he was nearby. Nothing. He followed the path that led to the beach. The sand was still wet from the storm, and debris was everywhere. Fallen branches, seaweed washed up by the violent waves, even a beach chair someone had left behind, now broken and buried in the sand. Alice searched behind every dune, under every pier, inside every nook and cranny where a frightened puppy might have hidden. Her sneakers sank into the wet sand, making each step more difficult, but she didn't stop. The hours passed, and the sun rose in the sky, bringing a humid heat that made sweat mix with the tears Alice couldn't control. She was growing desperate, feeling hope slip through her fingers like wet sand under her feet. On the way back, she passed a man walking his own dog. Alice approached quickly, her voice trembling and urgent. "Sorry to bother you, but have you seen a French bulldog around here? Cream-colored, black snout? He ran away yesterday during the storm." The man shook his head with sincere regret in his eyes. "I didn't see it, but I'll keep an eye out. If I find it, how do I let you know?" That's when Alice realized the terrible mistake she'd made. Biscuit did wear a collar, yes, and it had Alice's phone number engraved on it. But what if he lost the collar? What if it had come loose during his desperate escape? What if someone found the dog, but had no way of knowing he had an owner? Panic gripped her with renewed force. How had she been so careless? How had she not thought of this before? Alice ran home, her breath coming in short gasps, not only from the physical exertion, but also from the anxiety that gripped her chest like a vice. She went inside, picked up the phone, and considered who to call, but realized she didn't know anyone in town. This was the harsh reality of the loneliness she had chosen. There was no one to ask for help, no one to share her despair, no one who cared enough because she had built walls so high no one could break through. On the second day, Alice expanded her search. She walked streets she'd never visited before, knocked on the doors of people she'd never met, and asked at every business if anyone had seen her dog. The answers were always the same. "No, I'm sorry. I'll keep an eye out. I hope you find him soon." Kind but empty words, words that wouldn't bring Biscuit back. Alice's legs felt heavy, her feet ached, her head throbbing with exhaustion and dehydration. But she couldn't stop. At every corner she turned, every new street she walked, there was a glimmer of hope that she would see that stocky little body running toward her. It was at the end of the second day that the idea came to her. Posters. She needed to make posters with Biscuit's picture and put them up all over town. That way, even if he'd lost his collar, people would know he had an owner, that someone was desperately searching for him. Alice stayed up all night, making the posters. She chose the best photo of Biscuit she had, the one where he looked directly at the camera, with that funny, adorable expression only French bulldogs can achieve. Beneath the photo, he wrote in large letters, "Missing," followed by his description, his name, and two crucial pieces of information, his phone number and his address. Including the address was a difficult decision. Alice had hidden herself from the world, and now she was exposing her home for the entire town to see. But there was no choice. Biscuit was more important than her privacy, more important than her fear of opening up. On the morning of the third day, Alice set out with a stack of posters and tape. She stuck them on the grocery store door, the bulletin board in the small library, the lamppost in front of the pharmacy, the gas station entrance, and the outside wall of the church. People stopped to read, and Alice saw the compassion on their faces. Some even approached to say they would help search, that they would share the information, that they would pray that Biscuit would be found. Alice thanked him mechanically, but inside she felt a strange mix of gratitude and shame. Gratitude for the kindness, shame for having been so closed off, so distant, so convinced she didn't need anyone. Because now, when she desperately needed help, she was discovering that people wanted to help, that the community she had rejected was there, with open arms, even without really knowing her. Margaret from the grocery store held her hand as Alice taped the sign to the door. "We'll find your puppy, honey. Don't give up." Alice just nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She returned home at dusk, exhausted in body and soul. She sat on the porch, staring at the empty street, expecting that at any moment the phone would ring with news or that Biscuit would come running down the street. But the phone remained silent, and the street remained empty. Night fell again, and Alice found herself doing something she hadn't done in a long time. She prayed. She wasn't sure how to do it anymore, wasn't sure if she still believed, but the words came out anyway. "Please, just bring him back. I promise I'll be better. I promise I'll let people in. Just bring my Biscuit back." It was a desperate bargain with the universe, a plea from someone who had lost almost everything and couldn't bear the thought of losing the only thing that still held her together. And as the night wore on in silence, Alice didn't know her prayer was already being answered. Not in the way I imagined, but in a much more meaningful way, because sometimes what we ask for isn't exactly what we need. And sometimes the universe gives us exactly what our soul is craving, even when we don't have the right words to ask for it. The man with the collar. The morning of the fourth day arrived with a clear blue sky, as if the storm had never happened. Alice had barely slept, her body sunk into the sofa where she spent the night waiting for the phone that stubbornly refused to ring. She was making coffee more out of habit than desire when she heard a knock on the door. Her heart immediately raced. Had someone found Biscuit? Was this good news, or the news she'd most dreaded? Alice ran to the door and opened it so quickly that she nearly tripped over her own feet. On the other side stood an elderly man. He must have been in his 70s, maybe a little older. His white hair was carefully combed, his eyes kind behind thin-framed glasses, and his clothes were simple but clean. There was something comforting about his presence, something that conveyed kindness without words. "Are you Alice?" he asked in a calm, measured voice. "Yes, I am," Alice replied, her voice trembling. "Have you found my dog?" The man shook his head slowly, and Alice felt her heart sink. But before despair could completely take over, he raised his hand, showing something he was holding. It was a collar. Biscuit's collar. Alice recognized it immediately. The faded blue color, the small metal plaque engraved with the phone number, even the small paint stain that had splashed on it when she was painting the porch weeks ago. "I found this near the beach, next to the old canoe on the sand," the gentleman explained. "I saw the sign at the bakery this morning and recognized the number. I thought you might like to know." Alice took the collar with trembling hands. She held it to her chest as if it were the most precious thing in the world, and in that moment, it was. It was the only physical connection she still had with Biscuit, the only proof that he was real, that he hadn't just disappeared from the universe. The tears began to flow before she even realized it. They weren't tears of joy, because Biscuit was still lost. But they weren't just tears of sadness either. They were tears of something more complex, a mixture of renewed hope and gratitude for this gesture from a complete stranger. "Thank you," she managed to say between sobs. "Thank you so much for bringing this to me." The man gave a small, understanding smile. "My name is Nicholas," he said, "and if you'll allow me, I'd like to help you look for your puppy." Alice looked at him in surprise. Why? Why would a stranger bother to help someone he didn't even know? As if reading her thoughts, Nicholas continued. "I also had a dog once. Losing him was one of the hardest things I've ever been through. If I can prevent someone else from feeling that pain, or at least help lessen it, it would be an honor." There was such genuine sincerity in his words that Alice couldn't refuse. She nodded, still clutching the leash to her chest. "Was he near the old canoe?" Alice asked, trying to concentrate on the clue Nicholas had brought. "Yes, right there. It was half buried in the sand, so it's probably been there since the storm." Alice felt a glimmer of hope. If the collar was there, maybe Biscuit was still in the area. Maybe he hadn't gone far. Maybe there was still time to find him before something terrible happened. "Can I go with you there now?" Alice asked, already grabbing her car keys. Nicholas nodded. "We'd better walk. I know some shortcuts and places where a scared puppy might have hidden. I've lived here my whole life. I know every corner of this city." They left together, walking side by side in comfortable silence. Alice held Biscuit's leash like a talisman, as if it could guide her to her owner. Nicholas walked with a steady gait for someone his age. Every now and then, he'd point to a spot and explain. "That's where dogs tend to go when they're scared," or that abandoned deck would be a good hiding place. Alice could tell he truly knew the area. More than that, she could tell he genuinely cared. It wasn't just courtesy or social obligation, it was genuine, a kindness that seemed to come from a deep and genuine place. As they walked, Nicholas told him about his own dog, a Labrador named Max, who had been his companion for 15 years. He told him how Max had died peacefully, old and tired, and how the house had become so quiet after he was gone. Alice listened, and for the first time in months, she felt like she was actually talking to someone. Not just exchanging polite words, but sharing something real, something human. They searched for hours. They checked under decks, behind bushes, inside small caves in the rocks along the beach. Nicholas called out to Biscuit in a strong, clear voice, and Alice felt a strange relief that she wasn't alone in her search. As the sun began to set, Nicholas suggested they stop for today. "We'll continue tomorrow," he said. "Don't give up. Dogs are more resilient than we think." Alice nodded, exhausted, but strangely less desperate than she had been in the previous few days. There was something about Nicholas's presence that calmed her, that made her feel that maybe, just maybe, things could work out. Before they said goodbye, Nicholas gently touched her shoulder. "You're not alone in this, Alice. We'll find him together." And for the first time since arriving in that city, Alice didn't feel afraid of those words. She didn't feel the urge to retreat, to build walls, to protect her wounded heart. Because sometimes when we're at rock bottom, that's exactly when we discover there are still good people in the world. People who reach out without asking for anything in return, who offer light when everything seems dark. And Alice was beginning to realize that maybe, just maybe, she needed this light more than she realized. The sound that changed everything. The following days became an unexpected routine. Every morning, Nicholas would show up at Alice's door at the same time, always with a kind smile and encouraging words. They would set out together to search for Biscuit, exploring every corner of the small seaside town. Alice discovered that Nicholas had been a widower for 5 years. His wife had been the love of his life, and even after all this time, he still spoke of her with a tenderness that made Alice's heart ache. He had children who lived in other cities, grandchildren he visited on vacation, but he spent most of his days alone. There was a loneliness in Nicholas that mirrored her own, but it was different. It wasn't a chosen loneliness, built with walls of protection and fear. It was a loneliness that came from loss, but it hadn't hardened his heart. He remained kind, still open, still believing in the goodness of people. Alice found herself listening to his stories with genuine attention. He talked about their 43 years of marriage, about meeting his wife at a church dance, about how they built their life together brick by brick, day by day. Not everything was perfect, Nicholas said as they walked along the beach. We had our difficult times, our fights, our disagreements, but we always came back to each other. We always chose love, even when it was hard to choose. Alice thought about her own broken marriage. She and her ex-husband had never chosen love in difficult times. He chose other women, and she chose wounded pride and resentment. Neither of them truly fought for what they had. "You're very quiet today," Nicholas observed gently. "Do you want to talk about it?" And to her own surprise, Alice did. For the first time since the divorce, she wanted to talk about what had happened, not out of anger or bitterness, but simply to release the weight she was carrying. She talked about her marriage, about the betrayals, about how small and insignificant she felt. She talked about the friends who abandoned her, about how she came to that city wanting to hide from the world. Nicholas listened silently, only nodding every now and then, letting her spill everything without interruption or judgment. When Alice finished, he was quiet for a few moments before speaking. "You know what I've learned in 70 years of life? That hurt people hurt other people. Your ex-husband probably carried his own wounds, his own insecurities. That doesn't excuse what he did, but it explains it. And you, my dear, carry wounds that long predate this marriage." Alice felt something stir inside her, as if Nicholas had touched a truth she had always known but never had the courage to admit. They kept searching day after day. The hope of finding Biscuit slowly faded, but paradoxically Alice felt less desperate. Nicholas's constant presence, his conversations, his quiet wisdom were filling a void she hadn't even known existed. On the 7th day of searching, they decided to explore an area further from the beach, where there were some old abandoned boats. Nicholas knew the place well. He used to go fishing there when he was younger. The sun was just beginning to set when they came upon an old canoe turned upside down on the sand. It was the same canoe where Nicholas had found the collar days before. Alice was about to suggest that they go back, that maybe it was time to accept that Biscuit wouldn't be found, when she heard something. Biscuit, a faint, almost imperceptible sound. A muffled bark, her entire body froze. "Wait," she whispered, grabbing Nicholas's arm. "Did you hear that?" They stood completely still in absolute silence. And then it came again, a faint, desperate bark coming from somewhere nearby. Alice cried, her voice cracking with emotion. "Biscuit, is that you?" The barking was louder this time, more insistent, and it was coming from under the canoe. Alice ran to the boat, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it was about to burst from her chest. Nicholas quickly followed, and together they tried to lift the canoe, but it was heavy, partially buried in the sand. "Wait, let me help you properly," Nicholas said, positioning himself better. With combined effort, they managed to slowly turn the canoe over. And there, huddled and trembling, was Biscuit. The French bulldog was thinner, covered in sand, and clearly scared, but he was alive. His eyes widened when he saw Alice, and he began barking frantically, trying to get out of the narrow space where he'd been trapped. Alice fell to her knees and scooped the dog up in her arms, clutching him to her chest as she cried uncontrollably. Biscuit licked her face desperately, also crying in his own way, those high-pitched sounds dogs make when they're excited. Nicholas watched the scene with tears in his eyes, smiling with the wisdom of someone who understands that he is witnessing something greater than just the reunion of a woman and her dog. "He probably got tangled up in something and lost his leash," Nicholas said softly, "and then he hid under the canoe during the storm. The wind must have capsized the canoe, trapping him inside. Poor little thing." Alice couldn't stop crying, kissing Biscuit's head, thanking God, the universe, Nicholas, anything that had conspired to make this moment happen. "Let's take him home," Nicholas suggested gently. "He needs water, food, and a good bath." On the way back, with Biscuit safe in Alice's arms, Nicholas began to tell a story. "You know, when I lost my wife, I thought I'd never be happy again. I thought my life had ended along with hers. But I learned something important. Life doesn't end when we lose someone or something. It transforms. And sometimes, if we let it, it transforms into something even more beautiful." Alice looked at him, understanding what he was trying to say. She had come to this town wanting to hide, wanting to live in a safe bubble where nothing could hurt her again. But life had other plans. It had placed Nicholas in her path. It had even used the temporary loss of Biscuit to teach her something essential, that needing someone wasn't weakness, and that opening your heart again didn't mean it would inevitably be broken. "Thank you, Nicholas," Alice said, her voice still cracking, "not just for helping find Biscuit, but for everything." He smiled, that gentle smile she had come to recognize and appreciate. Sometimes God gives us exactly what we need, even when we think we're looking for something completely different. And in that moment, walking back home with Biscuit in her arms and Nicholas at her side, Alice finally understood what he meant. The lesson the heart needed. The months that followed transformed Alice's life in ways she never could have imagined. Biscuit made a full recovery from his frightening adventure, returning to his usual playful, affectionate self, though he now wore 2 collars with identification tags, just in case. But the real transformation wasn't in the dog. It was in Alice. Nicholas began visiting her regularly, not every day, but a few times a week. Sometimes he'd bring fresh bread from the bakery, other times he'd just stop by to chat on the porch while they drank coffee and watched the sea. He became the grandfather Alice never had. Her own grandparents had died when she was a child, and she always missed that wise, welcoming presence that only older people can provide. Nicholas had a unique way of giving advice. She never directly told Alice what to do, but rather told stories from her own life, of mistakes she'd made, of lessons she'd learned. And somehow these stories always hit exactly the point Alice needed to hear. One particularly difficult afternoon, when Alice was struggling with the anger she still felt toward her ex-husband, Nicholas told her about a co-worker who had betrayed him years ago by stealing credit for an important project. "I was furious for months," Nicholas said, shaking his head. "I plotted ways to get revenge, to expose the truth, to make him pay for what he did. But you know what happened? I was the only one suffering. He went on with his life as normal, while I was consumed with bitterness." "And what did you do?" Alice asked. "I learned that forgiveness isn't about saying what someone did was right. It's just about deciding you won't carry the burden of anger anymore. It's about freeing yourself, not the person who hurt you." Alice let those words sink into her heart. She realized she had carried her anger at her ex-husband like armor, believing it protected her, when in fact it only imprisoned her. Nicholas also taught Alice about community. He introduced her to his friends, to the neighbors she had avoided for so long. Margaret from the grocery store became a dear friend. The elderly couple who had invited Alice to their barbecue months earlier invited her again, and this time she accepted. Slowly, Alice began to feel part of that small town, not as a passing tourist, but as someone who truly belonged. People greeted her by name on the street, stopped to chat, asked how Biscuit was doing. And the most amazing thing was that Alice no longer felt afraid. She no longer felt the need to protect herself from everyone. She had learned that there are good people in the world, people who care, people who extend a helping hand without expecting anything in return. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Alice finally asked something she'd been thinking about for weeks. "Nicholas, why did you help me? When you showed up at my door with Biscuit's collar, you didn't know me. Why did you bother?" Nicholas was silent for a moment, considering his answer carefully. "When my wife was dying, she made me promise one thing. She said I shouldn't shut myself off from the world, that I should keep being kind, keep helping people, keep living even when she was no longer here." He paused, slowly cleaning his glasses before continuing. "At first, it was hard. I wanted to isolate myself. Just stay home and cherish memories. But then I realized something. Every time I helped someone, every time I made a difference in someone else's life, I felt her with me, as if she were smiling, telling me I was honoring her memory in the best way possible." Alice felt tears well up. "You honor her every day," she said softly. "And you, my dear," Nicholas replied with a smile, "are honoring the second chance life gave you. Many people would go through what you went through and close themselves off forever, but you chose to open yourself up again. That takes immense courage." Alice realized he was right. She had come to that town broken, hurt, convinced she would never trust anyone again. But life, in its mysterious wisdom, had other plans. She had placed Biscuit in her path when she most needed unconditional companionship. She had allowed him to get lost, not as punishment, but as an opportunity. An opportunity for Alice to realize she needed help, that she couldn't do it all alone, that relinquishing control and trusting others wasn't a sign of weakness, but of strength. And she had placed Nicholas in her path, a stranger who became a grandfather, a mentor, a friend, someone who showed her that not all people disappoint, that there are genuinely good human beings who do good simply because it's the right thing to do. The secret Alice finally understood wasn't complicated. It wasn't a profound philosophical revelation or a mystical answer to life's problems. It was simple. She should never have closed herself off to people. Yes, she had been hurt. Yes, there were bad people in the world, but there were also people like Nicholas. There were welcoming communities, true friendships, love that doesn't hurt. She had come seeking solitude, but what she really needed was connection. She had come wanting a friend for her dog, but what she gained was much greater. A chosen family, a place to belong, and the wisdom to understand that life is good when shared. "You know what's funny?" Alice said, laughing softly. "I just wanted to be alone. Just me and Biscuit, away from everyone." "And what did you discover?" Nicholas asked, even though he knew the answer. "I didn't want to be alone," Alice admitted. "I was scared, afraid to trust, afraid of getting hurt again. But you showed me it's worth the risk, that a life without connection isn't really a life." Nicholas placed his wrinkled hand over hers. "And you showed me that I still have purpose, that even at my age I can still make a difference in someone's life. So, thank you, Alice, for letting this old man be a part of your journey." They sat there as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink. Biscuit slept at Alice's feet, snoring softly, completely oblivious to the depth of the moment he was witnessing. And Alice finally felt at peace, not because her life was perfect, but because she finally understood it didn't have to be. She had friends, she had a community, she had Nicholas. She had learned that not all people are bad, that trusting again is possible, that the heart can heal when it finds the right people. The storm that took Biscuit had also swept away the walls Alice had built around herself, and in their place, something much more beautiful blossomed: hope, trust, and the certainty that I would never be truly alone again. What really matters. Today, when Alice walks along the beach with Biscuit, she no longer avoids people. She smiles, waves, stops to chat. The beachfront house is no longer a refuge from solitude, but a home full of life and visitors. Nicholas still shows up a few times a week, and Alice has lost count of how many times he has saved not only her dog, but her own soul from losing herself in bitterness. She learned that life has a curious way of teaching us exactly what we need to learn. Sometimes through loss, sometimes through strangers who become family, sometimes through storms that seem to destroy, but are actually just clearing the way for something new to blossom. Alice came to that town wanting a friend, someone to fill the void left by her broken marriage, and she gained so much more. She gained a grandfather, a community, and most of all, she gained herself back. Because in the end, what really matters isn't avoiding pain, but finding people who make it more bearable. It's not building walls, but bridges. It's not living alone in fear of getting hurt, but living fully, knowing that the risk is worth it. Have you ever experienced something similar? Have you ever discovered that what you were looking for wasn't exactly what you needed? Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel and share this video with your friends.